November, after years of silence, Chris Watts's father finally steps forward. His tone is calm, yet his words are heavy. He insists his son wasn't a monster, but a man broken by PTSD. The claim slices through everything we thought we knew. But can a father's voice overturn the image of a confessed killer? Or does it open the door to even darker questions about what really happened on that August 6, 2018? Frederick, Colorado, a quiet suburb. Families tucked into their evening routines, the calm of late summer hanging over the cul-de-sac. But on this night, a claim would later emerge that Chris Watts sat down and wrote a letter carefully dated, the words etched in small, deliberate handwriting. The message was chilling in its simplicity. If anything happens to me or the girls, I would never hurt my daughters. That line alone could have rewritten the story we thought we knew. If it existed, it meant he was setting a stage a full week before his wife and children were gone. If it didn't, then why would anyone tell it at all? This is where fact and allegation collide and where silence can speak louder than evidence. Investigators were clear when the rumor surfaced. Detective Balhav, who helped lead the case, looked baffled when asked about the supposed letter. The district attorney's office echoed the same response. They had never seen it. It wasn't logged, cataloged, or even mentioned in discovery. Thousands of texts, emails, GPS logs, and interviews, yes, but not this. And in the careful order of criminal proceedings, something that explosive would never have been quietly overlooked. Still, the claim refuses to die. For some, the absence itself suggests cover-up, a truth withheld from public record. For others, it is simply grief reshaping memory, a desperate attempt to soften a brutal reality. Both explanations carry weight, but neither answer satisfies the gnawing question. Why raise the specter of a letter if it never truly existed? To believe the letter is to believe in premeditation, a man planting evidence to frame his wife, foreshadowing the betrayal to come. To reject it is to believe the Watts family clung to a phantom, a page that could absolve their son in their eyes if not in a court of law. Either way, the story lives in shadow, and shadows always cast doubt. For Shannon's family, such a note would have been devastating, suggesting she was painted as a threat in her own home. For Chris's parents, the claim becomes a lifeline, evidence, however flimsy, that their son wasn't acting out of pure malice. This is the power of absence in true crime. It lets grief and loyalty create competing versions of truth. And once spoken, even without proof, a claim like this cannot be unspoken. Before we go deeper into the words of Chris Watts's father and why he chose to finally break his silence, let me pause for just a moment. This channel exists to tell these stories fully without shortcuts and with the honesty victims deserve. If you haven't already, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Your engagement ensures these voices are never forgotten, and these cases remain alive in our collective memory. Now, back to the letter. A single sheet of paper that no one has ever seen becomes a haunting metaphor for the case itself. Chris Watts, a man who buried the truth beneath rehearsed lies, is now said to have written a prophecy in his own hand. If genuine, it was a calculated attempt to plant suspicion and control the narrative before blood was ever spilled. If false, then it is the most tragic kind of invention, born not from malice, but from the unbearable need to believe there was more to the story than a father murdering his family. This is where our journey begins. In the silence of an empty evidence file, in the weight of a sentence that has never been proven, and in the space between what was said and what was real. And so I leave you with this. If you were told such a letter existed in your family, would you hand it over to police without hesitation, confront the person it accused, or lock it away in the hands of a lawyer, saving it for the day it mattered most? Because sometimes it's not the evidence we hold that shapes the story. It's the evidence that never appears. When Netflix released its documentary on the Watts case, the public consumed it with intensity. The focus was almost entirely on Shannon, her family life, and the tragic loss of her children, shaping how the world would come to understand the case. Story's central light, while Chris was cast in shadow as the irredeemable villain. For Shannon's family, it was justice through narrative. For the wider audience, it was clarity. Good and evil neatly divided. But for Chris's father, Ronnie, it was a portrayal that felt unbalanced. Until that point, Ronnie had remained in the background. His wife Cindy had spoken to reporters, given interviews, and shared her thoughts publicly more than once. He, however, had chosen silence. He watched the case unfold, watched the world take sides, and kept his words contained. Then, months after the documentary, he made an unusual choice. A YouTube channel called Revelation in the Reckoning. He sat for a 30-minute question and answer session. There were no studio lights, no polished sets, no national headlines, just a father deciding it was time to speak. For Ronnie, the decision wasn't about defending the indefensible. He knew the gravity of what his son had done could never be erased. But he felt world had seen only one version of events. A version that painted Shannon as flawless and Chris as entirely monstrous. Ronnie believed that when someone is depicted as perfect, another story inevitably emerges in response. His purpose wasn't to shift blame away from his son, but to argue that human beings are more complicated than the documentary allowed. He wanted listeners to consider that the truth wasn't captured in a single lens. The way he spoke was telling. His voice was steady, but he paused often as if weighing each word before letting it go. He leaned forward slightly, answering questions in a tone that carried sorrow more than anger. He did not shout, did not accuse, did not lash out. Instead, he tried to reason with an audience that had already judged his son. To some, his calmness read as dignity. To others, it was denial wrapped in composure. Either way, his presence was striking precisely because it was so rare. Ronnie stressed that his son was not the sum of his crimes, at least not in the way the media had portrayed him. He acknowledged Shannon's qualities but bristled at the narrative that left no space for flaws, no space for conflict, no space for the truth of a complicated marriage. He wasn't rewriting the crime. He was challenging the way it was told, and in doing so, he forced viewers to wrestle with an uncomfortable reality. In every case like this, there are multiple sides, and those sides do not always align. Of course, speaking out carried risks. Ronnie knew he would face criticism for defending the indefensible even indirectly, yet he still chose to appear to let his voice enter the record. For him, silence had begun to feel like complicity. Breaking that silence was not about clearing his son's name, but about creating space for the idea that stories, even in true crime, are rarely one-dimensional. It leaves us with a dilemma. When a grieving parent steps forward and insists the world has only heard half the truth, does that bring balance, or does it distort the facts we rely on? Does it help us understand? Or does it threaten to rewrite history in a way that dishonors the victims? Ronnie's quiet interview did not answer those questions, but it prepared the stage for his most controversial claim yet, his belief that his son had been suffering from PTSD. And when he said those words, the conversation shifted into far more dangerous territory. In every crime story, certain words rise above the rest. They echo in interviews, bleed through text messages, and leave their mark on court transcripts. In the Watts case, one word surfaced again and again, shaping how people understood the tragedy. That word was evil, a single word. Yet it carried different meanings depending on who spoke it and why. Ronnie, Chris's father, claims he heard it in the most private of settings. During a moment inside the interrogation cubicle, he says his son leaned close and whispered that Shannon was evil. According to him, that exchange never appeared in discovery because it was redacted. Investigators deny it ever happened. There is no official record, no audio, no transcript. But Ronnie insists he remembers it. For him, that word revealed not just resentment, but the bitterness he believed had been building for years. Still without proof, we are left to wonder, was it really whispered or was it remembered because a father needed it to be? In the official discovery, the word appears elsewhere, but in Chris's own voice. When pressed to explain the murders, he called them an act of evil cruelty. Those words were coldly factual, locked into a transcript. They were not about Shannon, not about his parents, but about himself. In admitting it, Chris gave the world a glimpse of how he saw his own actions. Inhuman, merciless, beyond repair. He was the one applying the word to what he had done, as if labeling it could somehow distance him from it. And then there was Shannon. On August 4th, 2018, just 9 days before she died, she sent Chris a long, desperate message in the early hours of the morning. She defended her children fiercely, lashing out at his mother for what she believed was a deliberate act of defiance. "I have to protect the kids from the evil of the world," she wrote. "I shouldn't have to protect them from evil family. Your mom is evil and willing to risk your daughter's life just to get under my skin." 3 uses of the word in a single message, each one sharpened with anger. For Shannon, evil meant betrayal within her own family and the danger it posed to her child. Here lies the tension. The same word spoken by a father, confessed by a murderer, and written by a wife meant something different each time. For Ronnie, it was a whisper meant to explain. For Chris, it was a way to describe his own cruelty. For Shannon, it was an accusation of recklessness and disrespect. The word didn't settle truth. It fractured it further. And in a family already pulled apart by anger, money problems, and secrecy, such language did more than express feelings. It escalated them. Words like evil don't stay quiet. They ripple outward, fueling public opinion, inflaming family loyalties, and deepening divides. They harden perception, leaving no room for forgiveness or nuance. In this case, evil became a mirror, reflecting whatever each person most needed it to mean. For Shannon, it was protection. For Chris, it was confession. For Ronnie, it was justification. But words alone don't tell the whole story. They raise questions, unsettle memory, and keep wounds open long after the acts are done. So, we are left to ask, when someone in a family uses that word, are they speaking truth, or are they fighting a battle with words that will scar everyone who hears them? And this was only the beginning, because Ronnie's insistence on Shannon being labeled evil would soon give way to an even more controversial claim that his son's crimes were not born purely of cruelty, but of trauma he believed had broken him from the inside. August 6, 2018, 7 days before the murders. A date that now feels like the first page of a tragedy. Some claim that on that night Chris Watts sat down and wrote a letter. Not long, not complicated, but deliberate. His handwriting, if genuine, carried the same markers people had seen before. Small, tight, lowercase letters and numbers drawn larger, almost exaggerated. And within those lines was a message that stunned many who later heard of it. He allegedly wrote that if anything ever happened to him or the girls, he would never hurt his daughters. If that letter existed, its meaning is chilling. It would mean Chris had been preparing, not reacting. It would mean he was already shaping the narrative before Shannon even returned from her trip, before the world around them collapsed. Such a document would mark not only premeditation, but a clear attempt to shift suspicion away from himself and onto his wife. That kind of planning separates crime of passion from crime by design. But the record tells another story. When law enforcement was asked about the letter, they denied it outright. Detective Baumhover, who worked the case from the beginning, insisted he had never seen it. The district attorney's office confirmed the same. And when the discovery files were released, thousands of pages of data, interviews, text logs, GPS records, even redacted conversations. There was no sign of any August 6th note. No scan, no copy, no mention. To investigators, the absence spoke louder than the allegation. And yet, those who believe in the letter's existence point to details they say can't be dismissed. The handwriting, consistent with Chris's style, the content matching his pattern of deflection and denial. To them, its absence from discovery proves not that it never existed, but that it was buried, redacted, overlooked, or intentionally kept out of sight. If that theory holds, then the implications are devastating. It would mean this crime was laid out days in advance while Shannon was away. And while 2 young girls were still alive inside that home. For the Watts family, the letter became more than evidence. It became a lifeline, a way to believe their son wasn't the cold, calculating killer the world saw in court. For Shannon's family, it became something darker, proof that they were still being asked to shoulder blame even after her death. One disputed page created 2 opposing truths, and each family clung to the version that made sense in their grief. This is what makes the allegation so haunting. If the letter was real, it proves planning. If it wasn't, it proves how far desperation can push people to search for meaning in a senseless crime. And when no physical copy exists, it forces us to confront a painful question. Do we treat such claims as serious evidence or as stories designed to cloud the truth? Because in the end, it is not the paper itself that haunts this case, but the uncertainty of what people are willing to believe. Before we continue, if you've been following this story closely, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every time you engage, it helps us bring forward the details that others overlook and ensures that the victims are never forgotten. If a disputed letter like this surfaced in your own family, would you hand it straight to police, confront the person it accused, or keep it hidden until a lawyer weighed in? The story of this case isn't just about what happened on August 13, 2018. It is also about what happened in the days and weeks that followed, because those decisions shaped everything the public would come to know about Chris Watts, his family, and the justice that was delivered. When the murders were first reported on that Monday morning, law enforcement in Frederick, Colorado, responded to what they believed was a missing persons case. Shannon Watts and the two little girls were gone, and the search stretched into the neighborhood with urgency. Neighbors gathered. Officers canvassed the area, and within hours the case took on the atmosphere of something far more serious than a simple disappearance. In the days that followed, the picture began to shift quickly. Chris's interviews on television, his appeal for his family's safe return, and his strangely calm demeanor raised suspicions. Behind the scenes, investigators were gathering digital data, interviewing witnesses, and zeroing in on inconsistencies in his story. By the end of that same week, the missing persons case had turned into a homicide investigation. It was a rapid escalation, faster than most people expected, but the evidence pointed sharply in one direction. Then came a turning point almost no one could have anticipated. On August 26th, barely 13 days after the murders, defense attorneys began discussions about a possible plea deal. The timing raised eyebrows because the investigation was still young, with discovery ongoing and emotions raw. To many observers, it seemed far too soon to be talking about avoiding a trial. Yet in the legal system, those conversations were very real. The defense knew the weight of evidence, and the prosecutors understood the risks of taking such a high-profile case into court, where every detail would be dissected. The pace only intensified as autumn wore on. While the public continued to speculate about motives, family tensions, and missing details behind closed doors, negotiations were moving steadily forward. And on November 6, 2018, the plea deal was made public. The shock was immediate. Instead of months, perhaps years of testimony and cross-examinations, the case was heading for resolution in less than 3 months. Many asked whether this was true justice, or whether the system was moving too quickly to avoid the mess of a trial that would reopen wounds, expose secrets, and place the families at the center of a media storm. Finally, on November 19th, the case reached its conclusion in a Weld County courtroom. Chris Watts stood before the judge and received his sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families, it marked the end of the legal process, but not the end of questions that still lingered. The speed of events from the murders on August 13th to the sentencing on November 19th was staggering. Just 98 days separated the first 9/11 call from the final gavel. That kind of pace is rare, almost unheard of in cases of this magnitude. The timeline tells its own story. From a desperate search for a missing mother and children to an arrest to plea discussions less than 2 weeks later, and a life sentence handed down in under 100 days, the escalation was relentless. To some, it looked like efficiency. To others, it looked like avoidance. The truth of why it moved so fast remains a matter of perspective. But what cannot be denied is how the rapid pace shaped public perception and left an enduring debate about what justice really meant in this case. Does a fast plea mean efficiency or an effort to avoid a messy trial? When Chris Watts was charged, most people assumed the road ahead would be long and brutal. A case like this, multiple victims, overwhelming evidence, a community watching in horror, was expected to go before a jury. Testimony would be heard, evidence examined, and every dark detail would be argued in open court. But that trial never came. Instead, District Attorney Michael Rohr revealed that it was the defense, not the state, that first brought forward a plea deal. Chris would plead guilty to every charge if the death penalty was removed. Rohr agreed, saying it was the best way to secure convictions and spare the victims' families from reliving the worst moments of their lives in a courtroom. On the surface, it sounded pragmatic, an exchange of absolute certainty for the risk of trial. Yet beneath that explanation, the decision left a shadow. To many, it felt as though the system had chosen speed over truth, resolution over revelation. People wondered if a trial might have uncovered things we'll never know. What unsettled the public even more was the secrecy. The defense had opened plea discussions as early as August 26, just 13 days after the murders. But the deal wasn't revealed until November 6. For over 2 months, the community believed the case was heading toward trial, while behind closed doors the outcome had already been shaped. That gap created its own storm. Why keep it hidden? What was being protected? Some argued the secrecy shielded witnesses. Avoiding trial meant sparing Nicole Kessinger, the other woman in the story, from a spotlight that would have consumed her. Others said it protected family members who might have been forced to take the stand and endure cross-examinations about private conflicts. And there were whispers about reputation that law enforcement, the DA's office, and even the Watts family wanted to avoid embarrassing details surfacing in open court. Whether any of those reasons were true was never clarified, but the silence left space for suspicion. By the time the deal was finally announced, the shock was immediate. People felt blindsided. They expected months of testimony, expert witnesses, and evidence laid bare. Instead, it ended with a quiet agreement revealed only after it was already settled. The community that had mourned the victims felt as though part of the process had been taken from them. Justice may have been secured, but transparency had been lost. On November 19th, the courtroom filled for sentencing. Families wept quietly. Reporters scribbled notes, and the judge read the words that would close the case forever. Life in prison, no parole. The silence of that moment was heavy, not only because it ended a chapter, but because so much had been left unsaid. No trial meant no chance to press for answers about motive, about the truth of what happened inside that house, about the secrets still buried in the timeline. For some, that silence was almost unbearable. The plea deal ended the legal process, but it did not end the questions. Was the secrecy a shield for the innocent or a wall built to keep the public in the dark? Did it prevent pain or did it prevent the truth? In high-profile cases, justice is not only about verdicts, it's also about trust. And when that trust feels shaken, even a life sentence can leave behind a bitter aftertaste. Should prosecutors disclose plea negotiations in high-profile cases or keep them sealed? When Ronnie sat down to defend his son, he spoke about pressure, trauma, and regret. He painted a picture of a man unraveling under the weight of his marriage and his own mistakes. But through all of his words, one absence was deafening. He never once mentioned Nicole Kessinger, the woman who had stepped into Chris's life just as his world at home was collapsing. For anyone who had read the case files, that silence was not accidental. It was deliberate, and it left a hole in the story too wide to ignore. The official record tells us exactly why she mattered. Nicole admitted to investigators that once she learned what Chris had done, she began deleting. Messages, photos, search histories, all of it scrubbed in the hours after his arrest. She said it was shocked that she wanted nothing of him left on her phone. Yet to detectives, it looked like something else, a calculated attempt to erase her connection, to shield herself from the glare of what was coming. And in that act of erasure, questions about her true role grew larger. By leaving Nishal's name out of his interview, Ronnie reshaped the narrative. Without her, Chris appeared as a man driven only by his marriage, a husband at war with domestic pressures. But when you put her back into the story, the motive looks different. Affairs are not side notes in cases like this. They are catalysts. They change the way someone sees their family, their responsibilities, and their escape routes. Omitting Nicole meant omitting the spark that prosecutors argued was central to understanding why the murders happened at all. That choice of omission cast doubt on everything else Ronnie said. If he was willing to leave out the affair, arguably the most explosive factor, what else was he holding back? True crime cases hinge not only on facts but on credibility. And in this case, credibility was strained. Silence is never neutral. Sometimes it protects, sometimes it deflects, and sometimes it exposes because what is not said can speak louder than what is spoken. Investigators pieced together enough of the digital trail to prove how deep Chris's double life had gone. Records showed late-night phone calls, secret searches for vacation spots, and even notes about building a future that did not include Shannon and the girls. Those traces painted a man who saw in Nickel a door to freedom. And that vision made the walls of his own life feel even tighter. When Nickel deleted her records, she tried to shut that door forever. But the fragments that remained were enough to show she had been part of the story, whether she liked it or not. And so the silence in Ronnie's interview was more than a father protecting his son. It was an attempt to control the frame, to remove a piece of the puzzle that made the picture too damning. Yet the absence of her name only amplified her presence, turning her into a shadow hovering over every word. For Shannon's family, for neighbors, for the public who watched, the omission cut like another betrayal. Because when someone avoids the hardest truth, the rest of their story becomes harder to trust. When someone skips the most damaging detail, do you trust anything else they say? When Ronnie finally stepped forward to defend his son, his words carried a desperate weight. He insisted that Chris had been suffering from post-traumatic stress, as though the horror of August 13, 2018 could be traced not to cold calculation, but to hidden scars no one else could see. For a grieving father, PTSD offered a lifeline, an explanation that softened the edges of brutality and replaced intent with pain. Yet, as soon as the claim was spoken, it divided those listening. Was this an honest reflection of his son's state of mind or a way to recast deliberate murder as the product of invisible trauma? The distinction matters. PTSD is not a phrase that can be dropped into conversation like a shield. It is a clinical condition diagnosed through history, symptoms, and treatment. It belongs to survivors of war, victims of abuse, and those whose lives were broken by violence they could not control. Chris had never been diagnosed. There were no records of therapy, no medical reports, no credible evaluations. What there was instead was a father's need to explain what felt unexplainable. In the absence of evidence, PTSD became less a medical reality and more a post hoc defense. A way to say his son was overwhelmed, not monstrous. But stress and trauma are not the same thing. Stress wears down patience and weakens decision. Trauma reshapes a person's entire response to the world. To collapse the two together is to blur accountability. To suggest that planning and violence are nothing more than reflexes. Yet the evidence in this case showed otherwise. Chris didn't simply break in a single moment of panic. He lied to police. He concealed evidence. He acted with chilling calculation before and after the murders. Trauma might explain suffering, but it does not erase deliberate action. Still, the narrative of PTSD lingered. It invited empathy into a story that many felt should only end in condemnation. For Shannon's family, the claim sounded hollow, almost insulting. To them, it shifted focus away from a mother and two children whose lives were stolen and placed sympathy back on the man who took them. But for some in the Watts circle, PTSD was a way to believe Chris had been pulled under by forces too strong for him to resist. This clash of interpretations revealed a broader truth. The human mind looks for patterns, reasons, and explanations, even when the facts are already clear. True crime often balances on that razor's edge between understanding and excusing. If every violent act is blamed on trauma, justice itself becomes blurred. Yet ignoring trauma altogether risks erasing the ways pressure, secrecy, and conflict can build toward tragedy. In Chris's case, the absence of a professional diagnosis makes the father's claim look less like truth and more like a story crafted after the fact. A story meant not for doctors or courts, but for the court of public opinion. In the end, trauma may shape behavior, but it does not dissolve responsibility. Ronnie wanted the world to see his son as a man crushed by invisible wounds. What the evidence showed instead was a man who made choices. Choices that destroyed his family and left scars no diagnosis could explain away. The question that remains is how far we are willing to let trauma frame or distort. The meaning of accountability. Can trauma explain actions without excusing them? Where do you draw the line? In the discovery files, long passages are crossed out with heavy black ink. Redactions are common, meant to shield children, protect witnesses, and preserve privacy. But for families already desperate for answers, those missing lines felt like shadows across the truth. Ronnie pointed to them as proof that critical pieces of his son's story had been cut away. But investigators reminded the public that these omissions were standard procedure, not hidden revelations. The deeper issue was not what was withheld on paper, but what Chris Watts chose to give up with his own voice in rooms where silence might have served him better. Inside the interrogation room, he had options. The law was clear. He could stay silent. He could demand an attorney. He could stop every question until counsel sat beside him. Yet he didn't. He spoke. First, he told one story, then another, shifting details as if hoping the truth might bend with him. When investigators pressed harder, he folded deeper, confessing to parts of the crime while trying to shape the narrative around what remained unsaid. Later, in prison interviews, he kept talking, knowing full well every word was being recorded. Inmates are told from the start, conversations can and will be monitored, and still he gave them his voice. Why? That question has haunted observers ever since. Some believe he thought he was smarter than the detectives, that he could spin versions of the truth and slip through the cracks. Others think he was desperate, a man cornered, trying to claw back control by speaking before anyone else could define the story. Whatever the reason, his words filled hours of tape. They were not dragged from him under duress, nor forced by tricks of the law. They were spoken, chosen, and preserved, evidence born from his own decisions. But while Chris was making his choices, his father was sitting quietly beside him. Ronnie had flown into Colorado to support his son at the moment the family was falling apart. Yet support can take different forms. He could have leaned across that table, stopped the questions cold, and demanded a lawyer. He could have shielded his son not from justice but from himself, from the instinct to keep talking when silence might have been wiser. That intervention never came. Instead, he watched as Chris stumbled, hesitated, and confessed piece by piece. The moment of advocacy passed in silence, and the silence changed everything. Why didn't he act? Was it faith in authority, the belief that the system would be fair? Was it fear of confrontation, the weight of facing detectives head-on, or was it denial, an inability to believe that the son he raised could have gone so far that a lawyer was already essential? We may never know. What we do know is that the opportunity was there and it was missed. And in that silence, the process accelerated. The investigation gained momentum, not because rights were stripped away, but because rights went unused. In true crime, rights are not abstract. They are the thin line between choice and compulsion. Chris Watts had the right to stay quiet. His father had the chance to insist upon it. Neither did, and once words were spoken, they could not be unsaid, only replayed in courtrooms and sentencing hearings as markers of guilt. The tragedy was not only in the crime itself, but in the moments where silence could have mattered and silence never came. If you were in that room, would you have stopped everything until counsel arrived? In every high-profile case, words compete with facts, families defend, lawyers spin, and suspects craft stories. But actions leave traces that cannot be edited or explained away. For investigators, Chris Watts' actions on August 13, 2018 became the foundation of the case. Unshakable physical evidence that spoke louder than anything he or his family could claim. At the oil site where he worked, those actions revealed themselves in the most chilling way. Investigators found his daughters hidden inside crude steel tanks. The openings were small, no wider than 8 in, requiring force and calculation to place them there. It was not a frantic accident. It was a deliberate decision to turn his workplace into their final resting place. Shannon's body lay in a shallow grave nearby, hastily covered with dirt. Together, these choices drew a map of intent, one that could never be erased. Then there was the porch interview given just 1 day later. Standing outside his home with cameras rolling, he spoke calmly, hands folded, voice steady, appealing to the public for prayers. Neighbors described it as eerie, too controlled, almost rehearsed. What looked at first like concern, later played back as performance. That clip, forever called the sermon on the porch, became a haunting reminder of how easily words can mask the truth, at least for a moment. Technology cut through the performance. Phone records placed him near the work site in the critical hours when his family disappeared. Work logs showed an unusual early morning trip to that location, one that made no sense in routine schedules, and the neighbor's surveillance camera captured what his mouth never admitted. His truck revering into the driveway, headlights piercing the dark, shadows moving as he loaded objects before dawn. Every piece of data told the same story. Investigators did not need speculation. They had forensics. They trusted what could be measured, documented, and replayed. No matter how many times family members spoke of misunderstandings, or his father suggested another version of events, the evidence stood still, solid and unchanging. It showed what was done when it was done and where. Actions revealed the truth, and the truth could not be buried. Do you believe actions reveal more than words when it comes to guilt? Or can words ever outweigh evidence? From the moment the case broke, competing narratives swirled like smoke. Family members suggested different truths. Defenders hinted at unseen pressures, and online voices dissected every text message, photograph, and video. Yet, amid all the noise, investigators held to what they called anchors, fixed, verifiable points that could not be shifted by opinion. The most immovable of these anchors came on November 6, 2018. When Chris Watts stood in a Colorado courtroom and pleaded guilty to every single count against him. There was no lengthy trial, no battle of witnesses, no chance for a jury to weigh competing stories. Instead, the defendant admitted responsibility with his own words. Less than 2 weeks later, on November 19th, Judge Marcelo Kopkow handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was not just one life sentence, but multiple, stacked one after the other, with additional years for tampering with the bodies of his children and for ending Shannon's pregnancy. The courtroom was silent as the weight of the punishment settled. Shannon's parents sat stone still, listening to a verdict that confirmed what they already knew in their bones, that their daughter and grandchildren were gone forever, and that justice, though incomplete, had spoken. Still, counter-narratives did not vanish. Chris's father insisted his son had been broken down, pushed past his limits, or that trauma explained choices that no father should ever make. Others, more quietly, suggested Shannon's drive and assertive personality had cornered him. They called her controlling. They painted her as relentless, but those claims were shadows, not facts. Shannon committed no crime. She was the victim, not the cause of what unfolded. To imply otherwise was to erase the truth that Chris himself had confirmed when he entered that guilty plea. Victim blaming is a cruel undercurrent in many true crime stories, but here it struck especially hard. Shannon's social media posts, once symbols of her pride and family life, became dissected by strangers who claimed she was too loud, too visible, too much. The tragedy of this was not only in the crime itself, but in the way her memory was dragged into the arena of speculation. Forensic evidence told investigators the story they needed. It placed Chris at the scene. It mapped his movements. It uncovered what he tried to hide. None of it pointed back to Shannon. None of it gave weight to the whispers that tried to shift the burden from the killer to the woman he silenced. For prosecutors, this case became a reminder that anchors are stronger than narratives. Anchors are the guilty pleas, the sentencing orders, the surveillance tapes, and the phone logs. They are the facts that stand no matter how loud the counterarguments grow. Without them, a story can drift, shaped by emotions and bias. With them, justice holds its line, and in this case the anchors were clear. Chris Watts killed his family, confessed to it, and accepted a sentence that ensures he will never walk free. The question that lingers now is not about his guilt, but about the stories that survive around it. Should the media continue to air unverified claims that cast blame on Shannon, a woman who cannot defend herself, or should those claims be buried with the speculation, leaving the anchors to stand where they always have, steady, unshakable, and final? It began with a letter and it ends with one. Allegedly written on August 6, 2018. It was said to carry a chilling warning that if anything happened to Chris or his daughters, he would never be the one responsible. The handwriting, the numbers, the phrasing. Supporters insist it matched his style. But the truth remains that letter has never appeared in Discovery, never been authenticated, and never been acknowledged by investigators. It lives in rumor and recollection, not in evidence. And its absence leaves the story divided between what people want to believe and what the record actually shows. In the courtroom, there was no division. Justice moved swiftly and decisively. On November 6th, Chris pleaded guilty to all charges. 13 days later, on November 19th, he was sentenced to multiple life terms without parole, plus additional years for tampering with his daughters' bodies and ending Shannon's pregnancy. Shannon's parents sat in silence, their grief laid bare in the stillness of their bodies. The judge's voice echoed across the room, firm and unrelenting, as he told Chris he would die in prison. That moment was not speculation, not narrative. It was the anchor of truth. And yet outside those walls, the counter-narratives continued to stir. His father spoke of trauma, of PTSD, of a son who had been pushed past breaking point. Supporters whispered about manipulation, about Shannon's personality, about the weight of expectation in a marriage on the edge. But none of those claims appeared in the forensic evidence. None of them matched the timeline, the phone records, the surveillance footage, or the shallow grave. Shannon committed no crime. She was not guilty of being ambitious or outspoken or determined. She was guilty of nothing. And yet in death she was asked to stand trial in the court of public opinion. This is the dangerous territory of true crime. When speculation is allowed to masquerade as fact, victims can be reshaped into villains. Shannon's posts, once celebrations of family, became dissected as proof of control. Chris's silence was painted as suffering rather than calculation. Even an unverified letter absent from the record became a weapon in arguments that sought to shift blame. But justice does not move on whispers, it moves on anchors. Anchors like guilty plea, anchors like sentencing orders, anchors like the evidence that cannot be bent or erased. The narrator leaves you here with this reflection. Explanations may shift, but evidence does not. Chris Watts confessed. He was sentenced to life. He will never walk free. That is the reality. No matter how many claims are aired or how many counter-narratives rise and fall, justice in court is complete. Justice in memory, however, remains contested, shaped by the way the story is told and retold, by what is included and what is left out. The question is not whether he is guilty. That has been answered, but whether we will allow noise to blur the anchors that should hold. Should future documentaries include unverified claims at all or only with bold disclaimers so the truth is never drowned out? Justice in court may be final, but the story lives on in memory and debate. Should unverified claims ever shape the truth, or should we anchor only in evidence? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our